let's try this for good or ill. I have here my copy of King Arthur Pendragon from 1990. It is called Third Edition, despite being the second published version of the game. And I want to talk about three aspects of the system as we have read them and as we play them as best we can. Now, how this relates to anything that you're used to saying or knowing about these things, or how it relates to how some other person, whoever they may be, has played this that you've known or heard about, or what you've seen in any other publication, supplements to this edition, or any other version of the game, none of those are relevant. We've got this book, we've got a few supplementary books, and we are primarily just seeing what we read and working with it as best we can. So, first thing is basic resolution, which in this game is handled by a D20. And it is treated very much as a percentage die with 5% increments. So therefore, if you have a 15 in something, you're rolling 15 or less to succeed. Now, we're going to talk about resolution with a target number of 19 or less right now. And in that case, a 20 is a fumble. And also in that case, a critical is your target number. The percentage, therefore, for either is exactly the same regardless of the actual rating in the skill. This could offer no difficulty under any circumstances. Now we look at the case of a target number of 20. You critical on a 20, and otherwise you simply succeed. Now, how about combat, or any situation with opposed rolls of various skills? In this case, it's always handled as a clash. So combat is not wait for your turn, strike on your turn, and then they wait for their turn, strike on their turn. In combat, both combatants are rolling simultaneously. And then the same thing goes for any other kind of skill, kind of opposition. But you know what? I'm tired of saying that over and over again. Never mind that. Fine. It's like in combat. Let's talk about combat. Here we go. I've got that 15 or less. You've got that, I don't know, let's say a 17 or less. So I roll, and if I succeed and you don't, that's easy enough, because it means that my attack will strike you and your attack does not strike me. Then, send the converse, of course. Then what about if we both fail? Also easy. There is no impact on or no damage for either of us. If we both succeed, then we look at who has the highest rolled value. So let's say we both succeed. My score is 15, yours is 17, but I roll a 12 and you roll a 4. So we treat that as my success and your failure for purposes of doing you damage. So those are the basics. There are a ton now of what if. We've got critical results, which if you're hitting is a matter of double damage. We also have the point that even if you roll lower than your opponent and they didn't get a critical, then you are treated as hitting. There's also the issue of fumbling, which usually involves dropping a sword or breaking any other weapon. But these are all just kind of, little what ifs, and they all have an answer. So far, all of this doesn't deserve video. All of this is pretty straightforward clash-based resolution, and we're done. Now for what I really want to talk about with the task resolution. It has to do with scores that are over 20. Now, how do you get a score over 20? Well, actually, you quite often have a score much higher than your listed value. If your value is low-ish, then you may be looking at, say, a 20 that you don't officially have. For higher scores, and also particularly if passions are involved, which have very big bonuses, then we'll be looking at scores that are easily in excess of 20. Often I would be rolling with a 25 or less, and you roll with a 27 or less, or even higher. In play, pretty much out of the gate, we were sometimes looking at scores in the 30s. You also get them from a variety of situational bonuses and penalties. So in terms of the bonuses, there's plenty of ways in which you might have 1, 2, or even 3 plus 5s to your roll. Let's be very clear here. It's not to your roll. It's to your target number. All such bonuses are to your target number. So you have a 15 plus 10 bonus has come in due to a passion, and the situational bonus gives you a plus 5. So therefore, you've got 15 plus 15 equals a target number of 30. There are a couple of effects to talk about. One is that you look at the difference between your new target number and 20, and that does become a bonus to the actual roll. That's the only time that I can think of where you actually have a bonus to the rolled result. Most of the modifiers in Pendragon are to the target number. Now that we have target numbers that are over 20, now we have something you add to the roll. So let's say I roll, what did I say before? I rolled a 12. Well, in this case, since I have plus 10, 30 in excess of 20, then what I have rolled is a 22. And we can continue from there. Now, what's a little tricky about this is that the rules in an earlier portion or in the basics go on at some length about how when you have these bonuses, the critical is still a 20. Obviously, you cannot roll a 25 or a 30 or whatever on a 20-sided die. You treat the 20 as a critical. Okay, well, that's good enough. But there's a great deal of talk about how the rolled value is a 20, the rolled value is a 20, the rolled value is a 20. And it all has to do with that notion of what's a critical. If you overread that, which might be easy to do, then you're saying, well, we'll never get anything. I mean, I could roll anything and it will end as long as the bonus puts me over, long as the bonus puts me over a 20, then I'm going to treat it as a 20, which immediately makes a hash out of the combat system in which the rolled values differences are what it's all about. So let's take all the same numbers. I have rolled my 15 or less target number, which is now a 30 or less. I have rolled a 12. That becomes a 22. Let's go ahead and say you had your 17, right? Let's give you the same situational bonuses, etc., for whatever reasons. So what did I say? We had the 32 or less, and you rolled a 4, which now becomes a 16. You see, of course, that my 22 is higher than your 16, and therefore I succeed, and I will do ordinary damage to you. This applies particularly when the rolled results plus their bonuses are both in excess of 20, and so therefore we've got these super high numbers, but we're still just looking for what's higher and what's lower. The confusing part is if you're reading the rules and checking something and you'll come across one of these phrases about, it's very stern, no matter what, the rolled value is going to be a 20, which may well apply for other applications of the rules, but in terms of combat makes absolutely no sense. For one thing, the difference between a success and a critical on a passion roll, which should be a big deal in that one gives you a plus 10 and one doubles your skill value. Skill values need to matter in combat. So therefore, the business about no matter what, if you get above a 20, the rolled value is a 20, that prose just simply cannot be permitted to apply to combat results, in which results like, well, I get, a 27 and you get a 22, I get a, 29 and you get a 28, and all that sort of thing actually matters very greatly in terms of that final outcome after the roll is made and after the bonus is applied. So that's our take on resolution and looking at the text in the book and trying to see what it's saying, how that one set of phrasing applies and does not apply. Now for the traits. I'm assuming everybody watching this knows that we're dealing with many pairs of terms with opposed qualities. Pious versus worldly, or valorous versus cowardly, and that everybody knows that the two numbers in question always add to 20. The flow chart or system of concepts seems to me to be quite clearly stated. The sequence of their use is a little iffy, but not confusingly so, just in the sense that it may be case by case, which little piece you should do first. But let's go through the pieces. You're looking at the ordinary situation in which the two traits range from 5 to 15. Again, adding up to 20. But what we're really saying is that neither one is 16 or higher. Most of the traits, most of the time, are going to look like that. So in that situation, here comes a knight into some circumstance in which that particular dichotomy seems relevant. Now, to go in the order that is explained in the book, the player may well say, I do this, which is, as we say, nothing more nor less than ordinary role-playing. They say what their character does. And basically, they just do it. And we're done. That would be the end of the trait use. They might as well not have been on the sheet, except to remind us that this is sort of a knightly choice. Now, it may be that the circumstance is scenario relevant enough or relevant enough to that character's historical development or whatever, that the game master says, oh, you went that way? Check that side. So for whatever reason, it may be a reason in the moment for that one particular night. It may be intrinsic to the scenario as prepared. It may be all kinds of things. But the point is that the player has still simply said what they were going to do. There was no rolling whatsoever. And in this case, that side gets checked. That in and of itself is a fair amount of system. The check, of course, means that during the winter phase, they have a chance to change those numbers based on, rolling a test of rolling for it. Okay, so what else can happen? Instead, and we're going to stick with the player side of things, here comes our knight, confronted with this circumstance, and pops up their hand and says, I'm rolling for it. And they go ahead and roll a single d20 once. Let's say I have a 12 in my not valorous, let's see here. Let's say I have a 12 in my pious and an 8 in my worldly, and here I am confronted with some relevant situation, and I go ahead and I say, player says, I shall roll, and we will see which way my dude jumps. You roll 1 through 12, it's pious, 13 through 20, it's worldly. And I proceed with my role playing. There's no chance for critical. It's just a range and a range. There's therefore no kind of checking whatsoever for later adjustments to the scores. It is development neutral. It doesn't really have a name. It is not, in particular, a trait test, which is the third kind of thing that can happen when there is some trait-relevant decision being made. So let's talk about this trait test thing, the third way. And in this circumstance, the game master, pops up their hand upon the knight encountering some circumstance that's relevant to pious and worldly, or particularly when the player begins to role play, and it may be that the game master says, this is a trait test. There's all kinds of reasons. It may be built into the preparation of the scenario. It may be a matter of that particular knight's, personal development. This particular trait pairing may have been relevant to their prior role playing and adventures, and so it's kind of important for them how this goes. All sorts of reasons why a trait test is suddenly called for, including if the player, no GM involved, says, this is a trait test. I'm feeling it. We're going to lay aside the idea that maybe the player is mining for checks or something, whatever. I'm not talking about bad play. This particular player is in earnest and says, whoa, I'm faced with this. Instead of just saying, oh, I'm rolling for it, like I was talking about before, no, this time the player says trait test. So somebody says, we're doing this for a variety of legitimate reasons. Oh, yes. And another thing I mentioned before, we were talking about traits, 5 to 15. Well, let's also now consider traits that are 16 or higher. And when the circumstances that seem triggering for that trait are there, then the game master can impose a trait test. Or rather, we should just say that on a 16 or higher, that we all know that you need to make a trait test about this stuff. So those are all the ways that a trait test can be identified as in action. How do we do it? I'll take that D20 and I look at the trait in question, and we're not talking about its partner. That's just hovering over there, not thinking about that right now. It's all about this trait. So I take this and I roll, taking that pious of 12 that I keep talking about, and it is an 11 or less, hence a success on that trait value, but not a critical. Under those circumstances, I now decide how I want my knight to behave. I am not enjoined to behave in a pious fashion. I can be pious or as worldly or some blend or whatever as I see fit. That's it. On a critical, if I nailed that 12, I must be pious. And I check pious for future consideration during the winter phase. If I rolled a 13 or more, then I still have, or I similarly have, complete openness of activity. I can be as pious or as worldly as I want. It just so happens that having reached this point in the flowchart, then if I behave worldly, I'll get a check for worldly. So that's the whole story of what happens if I have succeeded in the roll. Now, what happens if I have failed the roll? I have rolled 13 or higher. We're going to take the D20 and we're going to roll again, this time looking at the other trait, which in this case would be worldly 8. And I roll 8 or less. And if that happens, then I must be worldly. So it's not symmetric. It's not like that first roll. There is no discussion of criticals at this point. Apparently, just succeeding with the 8 or less on worldly is treated like a critical in the sense that I'm getting a check for it. So if that fails, so I failed on the first roll for my pious and I fail on the second roll for the worldly, then I can do as I please and no check is involved. I hope you can see that there are significant portions of these options in which I'm kind of bounced out of determinism and I'm back into playing the character as I see fit. So the trait test procedure is not in and of itself like the former option in which you roll to see what your knight does and you go this way or you go that way based on that roll. That was something that the player could have chosen to do when no trait test was in the offing. But in this case, in the trait test, there's all kinds of ways in which you're bounced out of the determinism, as I say, and you're back to playing the dude as you see fit. Now, this has led to any number of noticings, not confusions, because the way it's laid out is pretty clear in the text, I think. But it has led to some confusions in encountering other texts and a couple of other details. There's a bit in there that has to do with using opposed traits between two knights or opposed traits to deal with internal conflict. I think that internal conflict thing is a bit redundant because the whole idea of a trait test in the first place seems that the knight is experiencing internal conflict at all. So I don't know if that is just sort of an elaboration of what we already knew, or if that's supposed to be some new procedure of some kind. Anyway, there's some more text about trait testing, which we have just never found to come up in play. And so either we understand it or we don't, but it doesn't seem to have been an issue. I will also caution anybody from looking at any example in any of the published materials. The tendency to discuss traits in all of these adventures, all these sample adventures, doesn't match this procedure in the slightest. Now for passions, and I have to say I'm not doing a full rundown and encyclopedic list of each and every application of passions. There's quite a lot. I want to focus on their impact on conflict situations. And similarly to traits, if it's 16 or higher, then a passion is very, very easily triggered. It's effectively automatic under certain circumstances, and therefore, we have to pick up the die. But if it's 15 or less, then the player can decide whether this passion hitting in some consequential way is actually, going to occur. I should point out that the text is clear. This is a player decision when it's 15 or less. You have a passion. Let's say that for one reason or another, it's an 11 or less. And you have chosen to say this passion is, potentially firing at this time. And you have probably been role playing and circumstances have developed a little bit and you can see or you feel or that this passion, may well jump in with both feet, psychologically speaking. So here you go. You pick up your die and you're going to roll it. And in this case, you get an 11, which is a critical. Wow. Okay. Number one, check the passion. Number two, take whatever skill you want to utilize in the exercise of this passion and double its target value. Only one skill. Could it be an attribute? I mean, we've used it in play as a strength thing at one point, and that didn't seem to be violating anything. But another thing that we did, which is incorrect before we ironed this out, was it's not about everything that happens in a conflict. You don't apply it to all sorts of different activities. You have chosen one thing, technically a skill. And that what would be, if you get this critical effect, doubled. Fantastic. I have my sword skill of 15. It is now a target number of 30. Done. Or rather, then modified by other things. But fine, the skill itself, the target value has been doubled. Okay, what if I got a 10 or less and therefore a success on the passion, but not a critical? Then it's a plus 10. So in that case, my sword skill of 15 would now have a target number of 25. All right, there you go. I have been passionate about this thing and I really want to go and slash that dude with a sword in the grip of this passion. There I go. The mechanics now take us to looking at a failed passion check. Failed passion checks are extremely severe. If it is not a fumble, therefore not a 20, but I have rolled, in this case, 12 to 19, then I undergo melancholia, and my knight is basically depressed, inactive, or fleeing off, or otherwise, however, unable to proceed in this scene. They may be sulky, or they may be hysterical and weeping, or they may be ranting and raving, but they are in ungoverned behavior, and whatever it was you were up to is obviated. So it's not like a penalty or something. I mean, no, you are out of there. In a fumbled situation, so I rolled and I'm looking at a 20. It's even more severe than that. The knife runs off, just loses their mind entirely. They go mad. And probably will have to do in the upcoming winter phase, Lost in the Woods or something else perhaps, equally drastic. They may even end up in a wholly different adventure. They may be gone for a long time. I mean, we may not see the knight for another year of game time. All the others went back and handled their manor and whatever, but no, this one ran off in a frenzy, and that's the lot. So therefore, invoking a passion is notably, a very strong chance to say, and my dude may actually exit the scenario right now. There are lots of other things to talk about. One is what happens in the exercise of that skill. For example, if you succeed with your sword stroking, your sword slicing, then the implications for the winter phase and changing it and stuff like that are present. I won't go into the details. More importantly, if you fail that particular sword activity, so now we're talking about the exercise of the score of the sword with its bonus in place, and you end up failing, which in a fight you may well, even with this monstrous bonus, simply because the other fellow does in fact get a higher final outcome than you. When something like that. Anyway, when you fail in your skill activity, then you will undergo shock and you will be making an aging roll, no matter how old you are. So you could well, lose attribute points at that time. So even if you succeed in the passion check, you've still got that skill situation in the offing, and you can still pay a price for it in terms of your actual, bodily attributes. All right. Everybody's probably saying, and yes, I know, there's all sorts of other little things about, when you get a +1 on one of these checks, or whether you end up with impacts during the winter phase of one sort or another. Fine. What I want to talk about are a couple of conceptual specifications that I think need to be thrown to the table. We need to develop it as a table. And one has to do with the precise action taken on a successful passion check. It says act very, very strongly on a success and kind of fanatically or totally driven on a critical success. All that's understandable and probably is what was being played into via role-playing anyway. But what it doesn't say is which skill is involved. It may be obvious through the role playing up until that point that you have indeed, seized your sword and are striding toward the dude. And then either you or the game master says passion check, or it's 16 or higher. So, we all knew that was happening anyway. But that could be super obvious like that. But other times in more complex circumstances, more complex role playing going into that, check that passion, and then the player and the GM and everybody at the table should say, what skill are we talking about? And that seems to be wide open. So in other words, a passion check does not carry with it a specific action. Either the action is already implicitly or explicitly present in play as we've received it so far, or they have to choose. They have to say, run their finger up and down and say, that skill. This is actually pretty interesting. It means a passion does not have a specific act. Hate Saxons is not the same as attack Saxon on sight. Check your passion. You got a 16 on Hate Saxons. Check your passion. I succeed. Well, I guess you're attacking him. Well, actually, we were just sitting down to play chess. I'm putting my passion on my gaming skill. So you see, it's not a berserk check. It's whatever it is in the moment. And again, I caution against looking at the published adventures in which many times the way it's phrased is more like a berserker check. That if you succeed in your passion, then, well, obviously you're going to do this. Well, really? This is called role-playing, and wide circumstances, many of them very social circumstances, are at hand, or any number of the more positive ones as well. You perhaps have a passion that involves religious stuff, and you roll it, you succeed, and you're in some very complicated situation that involves all sorts of, Christianity and fairy and pagans, this and that and whatever. Go ahead. You feel, your passion kicks in. You're going to behave very strongly. This is true. And you choose your theology. So therefore, you are passionate enough about this that you have just ramped up your theology and can totally comprehend all of these nuances much better than you ordinarily would. All of this is, in my reading, 100% consistent with the instructions. I'm not bending things or expanding their scope or, interpreting. It seems very straightforward to me. This is what it says. Choose the skill. A few questions remain. There are plenty of circumstances, combat particularly, when this skill may be applied multiple times. It's not just a one-off clash like it might be for a chess match. So you do a bunch of sword strikes, or you're fighting with your sword round after round. Do you keep that bonus throughout? We have tended to say yes, that in any circumstance where things aren't going to be resolved until, the skill in question has been applied, several times, then the bonus will apply through the confrontation, and that goes for non-player characters and player characters alike. And that has worked fine. That is an interpretation. That's us looking at that and saying, well, how shall we apply that? And that's what we chose to do. These are our use of what we think we have read fairly. And you will note that there are some places where we do, in fact, have to arrive at a table concept. One of those places has to do with the traits. Let's back up to the traits and say, well, what order do we do it? should if the player pipes up, I go this way, then that does it obviate the trait test that the game master was about to say? Or does the game master say, actually, if I have a trait test to impose, I get to say that first, and it's going to happen regardless of what you were going to say in their free willish, option? I don't know. And it may even be case by case. A table can decide whether it's not case by case, and they will do it in this order, or a table can decide that it will be case by case, and there are some times when the game master says something like, here comes a trait test then, and the player says, actually, I'm just going to do this. And, oh, okay, well, that overrides it. You'll have to decide. A similar thing has to go with passions, and it has a lot to do with the assessment of a strong response. In many ways, a strong response is already present in the bonus to the chosen skill. Is that good enough? Or are we calling for, a speech on the player's part? Generally, we have found, and it hasn't been like a requirement so much as what somebody wanted to do, which is that if they succeed in that passion, then they usually, throw in a little bit of spit spraying, or something, maybe just the settling down and a glare, a look of determination, kind of a shadow rising up, behind the person, if you want to think of it that way, or whatever it is that really, blasts this passion into play as a fictional phenomenon. But I can think of a few times where we didn't really bother and just figured that, well, if we're seeing it, pump this skill so hard, we want to see the conflict, right? But figuring if the passion is pumping the skill so hard that it's just in the way that we're thinking about it as we play, perhaps factors into some narrations, who knows? But in other words, we didn't request, a sudden Oscar bait moment before we did anything else. So again, that's going to be more of a tableside preference, and again, possibly case by case use of the rules relative to delivery and the experience of the rules. All right, there you have it. Resolutions, specifically target values over 20 for opposed checks, traits, and passions. Right, wrong, illiterate, literate, agree, disagree, but so-and-so said, but this supplement says, whatever. I'm sharing with you how we've read it and what we've done.